The U.S. wants to do more trade with Africa. President Biden announced his plan Wednesday at a summit where nearly 50 heads of state from Africa attended.
The United States is all in on Africa's future. This MOU will unlock new opportunities for trade and investment between our countries and bring Africa and the United States even closer than ever. This is an enormous opportunity for Africa's future, and the United States wants to help make those opportunities real.
For more on this, let's bring in Michelle Gavin. She's a senior fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Michelle, why the focus on Africa?
Well, it's almost impossible to tackle any of the global challenges without engaging, this huge swath of the world. Africa's labor force is going to be bigger than China and India's by 2050, right? It's massively growing demographically. There's a set of important markets. Climate change can't be addressed without African cooperation. You can't deal with pandemic disease without African cooperation. So there are any number of reasons why the U.S. needs strong relationships with African partners.
And that's the U.S. view. Help us understand it from the views of the countries in Africa. And is there a disconnect there? And given the trust, and help us understand the trust gap between African countries and the U.S., where those differences in interests may diverge.
Sure. Well, of course, with so much diversity on the continent, different African states have different interests, but many of them, right, are interested in reform of international institutions so that African equities are taken into account. They're interested in debt relief. Many African countries are suffering with the serious debt burdens that were exacerbated by the global pandemic and then the Ukraine crisis. They have a range of specific bilateral interests. All of them want to grow their economies and create jobs. That demographic boom that I described means there are lots of young people entering the labor force every year. They need jobs. So they have a range of economic, political, security interests. There's tremendous insecurity throughout the Sahel. There's insecurity in the Horn of Africa. And in Central Africa. So they have a set of interests, but, historically, they have been concerned that the United States sees Africa through a lens of competition with other powers. This happened during the Cold War, certainly between the U.S. and the Soviets. And there is concern that U.S. interest in Africa right now is really about competition with China or really about boxing out Russia. And the Biden administration has really been at pains to express that they're interested in these relationships because they're important in and of themselves, not because they see it as some kind of zero-sum game where they're competing for influence with these other powers.
I want to get to the China question in a minute, but I don't want to let slip by the idea of the individual diversity of African countries and recognizing that diversity, but then also President Biden, when you talked about international institutions, President Biden has talked about having the African Union permanently join the G20. What would that kind of a connection, how would that be helpful? And can it be helpful given the diversity of the individual states within the continent?
Well, it's a great question. And I don't think we know the answer to it yet. But certainly, at the G20, in recent years, you've had different African heads of state often come join the meeting. They're sort of tasked with representing not just their country's interests, but a host of other interests from the continent. So it makes sense to kind of formalize this role, certainly, and makes sense broadly to look at the international institutional architecture and ask questions about African representation. But you're absolutely right. The African Union sometimes struggles to represent the diverging interests of its member states. And I do think that this will be a very interesting question for the Africans themselves going forward.
And then as a final question, can you help us gain wisdom about the competition between the U.S. and China on the continent. And while the Biden administration may be at pains to show that this is not about that, what's your assessment about the motivations in the administration with respect to this global competition with China?
I think both things can be true at once. There is concern about China's dominance, for example, of extractive industries, especially those that are critical to the green economy. There is concern about ensuring that the United States can continue to project power in the way that it has historically. There is also a very real and legitimate and frankly, quite late realization that African stakeholders in the international system are deserving of attention and are in fact critical to solving a whole set of international problems, as we talked about at the beginning. So I think that, both of these things can be true. Partnership with Africa can be in U.S. interests apart from any global competition, and there can be concerns simultaneously about the growing influence of other powers who would prefer a very different international system than the one the United States would like to see.
All right, Michelle, Gavin, thank you so much for being with us.